On its own, college wrestling is actually a pretty fun sport to watch. It's really fun to cheer along. I was fortunate to go to a college that actually has a huge wrestling program at the University of Iowa. So I've definitely got some rooting interest there, but it's fun to watch in general. But being an MMA fan, one of the other things I really like about watching college wrestling is that I know chances are at least a handful of the guys that I'm watching at some point are going to kind of pop back up at some point later on in the MMA world, whether it's when they're making their debuts or when they finally make their way to the UFC. So it's cool to see those guys while they're still in college and working on their wrestling skills and kind of using their wrestling. And what was interesting is that with ESPN having the national championships for wrestling, and they've had this for a little while, and now with them having the UFC, I was kind of wondering if they were going to do some sort of crossover. And it looks like they did. They had an article that was written by Ryan Hawkinsmith where he actually went around and talked to a lot of these wrestlers and asked what their thoughts on MMA were and their thoughts more specifically on competing in MMA. And one of the interesting things that I found is that a lot of big name wrestlers, a lot of guys who were national champions actually, have expressed some interest. And that was pretty surprising to me. So just going through the names that they had in the article, the one that caught me, that caught my attention the most was the Hodge Trophy winner for this year, which was Bo Nickel. Now he's in a bit of a tough spot from a weight class standpoint, and I think I'm gonna have to make this video probably the next coming week, in the next week or two. It's something I've been meaning to do for a while. Now that the college wrestling season's over, it's definitely something I want to get into. But I absolutely hate the way that international wrestling is done. I think it makes absolutely no sense at all to have an individual sport where, in order to qualify to even compete at the highest level, you have to be the best guy in your country. In any other individual sport, that doesn't make sense. If you think about some of the greatest rivalries, a lot of times it's two people from the same country. If you think about golf, now granted, I don't know that I would argue golf's a game and not a sport, but that's a whole other argument to be had there. But you think about Tiger and Phil. Imagine if you could only have Tiger or Phil in the Masters because only one of them would be able to qualify for the U.S. Like, imagine what you'd be taking away from the Masters by doing that. You think about tennis, you have like a Jimmy Connors or Pete Sampras and Andre Agassi. You can't have these guys go against each other in the same tournament because you can only qualify for one from the U.S. Think about Venus and Serena Williams. Only one of them can compete at Wimbledon because you can only qualify one at the U.S. Does that sound ridiculous? Yeah, it's completely ridiculous, but wrestling has done this forever, and they're going to keep doing it. And as a result, Bo Nickel's in this spot where if he wants to compete in the Olympics or if he wants to compete at the World Championships, he has to beat the best guy at his weight in the country. And right now, the best guys around his weight are just world champions. He's got to deal with David Taylor, potentially. He has to look at Jaden Cox, who's a world champion. Kyle Snyder, a multiple-time world champion. So he's got to break through one of those guys if he actually wants to even make the team and have a chance to compete. And as good as Bo Nickel is as a wrestler, is he going to beat one of those guys? Realistically speaking, I mean, sure, he's capable of it, but would I pick him to? No, I wouldn't. And so he may find himself to be not the odd man out here. And as a result, he's either going to kind of work at a professional job or he's going to keep competing in a combat sport, and that would be MMA. And it sounds like to him, MMA is the sport he wants to do. And as a fan of MMA and as a fan of wrestling, I'm perfectly fine with that because Bo Nickel is the exact type of wrestler that you want to see in MMA, and especially at a guy with his weight. He was at 184 for most of his career. So as far as where he competed in MMA, sometimes you see wrestlers go compete in MMA in weight classes lower than what they would compete at in college. Again, in college, you have to weigh in an hour before, and then you have to go out and compete. So sometimes if their weight doesn't get that big, or if it doesn't get that high after they graduate, then they may end up going down a weight class from where they competed at in college. Sometimes they get bigger after college, and therefore they competed at a higher weight regardless. So Nickel would be a guy who potentially could fit anywhere between 170 and 205. I don't think 205 would make a whole lot of sense. He was at 197 in college. I'm sure he can make 185. He probably could have made 185 or 184 this year if he absolutely wanted to, but decided to move up to 197 and just dominated that weight class. So he's a guy who could potentially be a good middleweight prospect in the future, or a light heavyweight prospect if he decides to go up. Right now, 205 is not a very strong weight class. We're seeing guys like Anthony Smith and Thiago Santos, who hardly could even get in the top 15 at middleweight, who are now earning title shots at 205. With that being said, by the time that Bo Nickel's ready to get to the UFC and potentially even start working his way up the rankings, I'm sure the landscape will change, but that's sort of where MMA is at right now. But Bo Nickel is definitely the biggest name here for someone who's looking to get into it afterwards. As far as some other people who are, and this is the line from Bo Nickel before I move on, it says the plan is to do Olympics in 2020, then start fighting. So again, the idea for him would be that he's going to probably look to get on the freestyle team for 2019. If he doesn't do it, keep working hard, keep working on his wrestling, take another shot at it in 2020, and then if he qualifies at the trials, then he'll move on and do the Olympics. If he doesn't qualify at the trials, then he'll begin his MMA career for then. I'm not sure what his plans are from a training standpoint. If he's just going to solely focus on freestyle wrestling right now, or if he's also going to do some jiu-jitsu here and there, if he's going to work on some striking as well. But either way, it'll be interesting to see how his career turns out. But I think that from a wrestling style, if you look at what sort of wrestlers tend to do really well in MMA, it's generally guys who can shoot well in space, because in MMA, it's not always in MMA being able to navigate the striking ranges and actually like get into a clinching position isn't always the easiest thing. So being a guy who can attack very well with his shot, who has an explosive shot and can make up distance really quickly, that's important. And then also once they're able to get the fight to the ground, being able to control from the ground, and those are two things that he can handle pretty well. And especially with control, Nickel's a very good pinner at the NCAA level. But another guy they talked to was the heavyweight champion, Anthony Cassar. Cassar is a bit of a smaller heavyweight. He was actually the 197 last year for Penn State, and sort of a weird situation there with their roster where they had a couple guys who were very high level at 197. So Cassar beat the guy who was number one in the country, Colin Moore, during the season. But then when he had to wrestle off for the spot, he ended up losing it to Shakur Rashid, who was this year's 184 pounder. So he actually moved up from 197 last year to the heavyweight class this year. So he did put on some muscle, but I think he's a guy who'd probably fit at 205 more so than 265 in MMA. But he's also mentioned that he has a similar plan, says he too wants to pursue the 2020 Olympics and will transition to fighting after that. So that's another guy who's a good shooter at that. His riding isn't at the level of Bo Nickel, but he can definitely get the fight to the ground. So he's a guy who I would definitely be interested in seeing how his MMA career pans out. A couple other names that they talked to. This is just mentioning that Bo Nickel's mom actually was a boxer who trained out at Jackson Wink MMA at a point, which is kind of interesting to see how there's a bit of a mix there. They also mentioned Sebastian Rivera, who is the number one seed at 125. He didn't win the tournament. He finished third. Fell to Jack Mueller in the semifinals, and then Jack Mueller fell to Spencer Lee in the finals. Spencer Lee actually had 2 matches with Rivera this year, lost both of them. So Rivera is as good as anyone in the weight class. You can definitely say that. Just Mueller didn't end up being the good matchup for him. But he is looking into doing MMA now. He's from New Jersey and actually has trained with Frankie Edgar. It goes into some details here. You can kind of read as I'm talking. But says that he even likes training off of his back sometimes. Is starting to get into submissions and seems like he's definitely got some interest there and wants to fight MMA as well. That's another guy who'd be interesting to see. He's definitely got a bit of an attitude on him, which is good for MMA, where you kind of have to be able to sell yourself and show some personality. So no issues there. That says I wake up at 8 a.m. in the summer and just go and grapple and get punched in the face all day. So it sounds like he's already training at the moment. And then they also mentioned Nick Suriano and told a little bit of a side story where Suriano was getting pictures after he won his title, and one of the guys taking a picture was Henry Cejudo. And Suriano was like, "Hey, what's up, champ?" But it sounds like Suriano also has some interest here. And the thing with all these guys is that everyone I named, as I mentioned, it's kind of like that log jam up at the upper weights for USA Wrestling, where it's going to be tough for some of these college guys to break in. For Suriano and for Sebastian Rivera, for the spots that they're looking to get at, it's not necessarily as tough right now. Thomas Gilman's the guy right now at 57 kilograms, which is like 125 pounds. He's a world silver medalist, but he's kind of been beaten here and there. Actually never won an NCAA title, which was a bit of an odd tidbit for him. So wasn't able to win the big one in college, but has definitely won some big ones. Obviously, by qualifying for the U.S., that's essentially, if you qualify for the U.S. team, you're essentially winning a national championship in freestyle. But then going on from there and then going into some of the bigger tournaments and doing well there. Gilman's a guy who you would think by the time he's done with his career, he could potentially transfer over to MMA. He's got a fantastic personality for it, but I don't know what his interests are. But either way, it seems as though it's going to be tough for Suriano, who lost to Gilman in college, or Sebastian Rivera to get a world team spot, at least in the United States. So for them, they may be forced, if they want to continue to compete in athletics, they may be forced in MMA rather quickly, and that could be good. So it'll be interesting to see if we get these guys who are all either number ones in the country at some point or national champions to move over to MMA. And I'd be happy to see it. Hopefully it does happen. And hopefully, in addition to some of these guys, we see some other guys. I know, for example, Deuce Rochel from Illinois, their heavyweight, has a really good background in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It'd be interesting to see if he has any interest in getting into MMA. And there are a lot of other guys like Max Murin from Iowa. He's got a bit of a boxing background in addition to the wrestling that he does. So there's some guys who aren't necessarily at the top of the totem pole, but who could still make a big impact in MMA. So hopefully they end up end up doing MMA, and hopefully everything goes well for him.